content is for adults only. It contains details of crimes against children. Viewer discretion is advised. If you haven't yet, please hit the like, subscribe and share. Thank you. Welcome everybody. Welcome to True Crime Chronicles at Safe State. Now then, I've been looking at mostly UK stuff, but today I want to talk about a case from America that has absolutely gripped my heart and attention, and that is Maddie Soto. And I'm going to do a series about this because, honestly, I have been down such a deep rabbit hole of evidence analysis in this case that literally I could sit here and talk for days on end and still not be able to fit it all in. So we're going to do a series, but just in this one, I want to talk about kind of setting the scene about what happened, who Maddie is, what her family life is, what happened to her. And then there's a couple of things that I want to talk about. One being the fact that Mum, Jen Soto, was given derivative use immunity and what that means and why it might have happened. Because I know that that's been kind of focused on quite a lot by other creators. So a huge shout out, first of all, to those creators who have me absolutely hooked on this case. And in particular, those who have taken huge time, effort, and have invested significant money in gaining access to all of the papers in this case under the Florida Sunshine Law. In the UK, we get very little information about ongoing cases, even past cases for that matter, and particularly those involving children. It's impossible to get your hands on the material. So it's quite unusual for me to see that level of material outside of the day-to-day work that I do. I work in child protection, I am a lawyer, and obviously I have access to case papers during part of my role. But in terms of things that are in the press and the public domain, there's very little of it. With Maddie, we know, clearly nowhere near as much as the police and the state attorney's office know, but we have access to an absolute wealth of information, and we're going to deep dive into it. But first of all, let's have a trigger warning. This case involves a number of topics that might mean that it's not the video for you. So it's going to involve essay and the unaliving of a child. So if that is something that is going to trigger you or cause you emotional upset, we'll always keep space open for you here. Come back on the next video. Skip this one. That being said, everybody is going to find it difficult to hear about this case. But it's important that we hear about it, talk about it, and think about it. It's important that it's in the public domain. It's really, really important that we think about how could this have been a different outcome? Because it very easily could have. There were huge red flags. Literally, Stephen Stearns, the perpetrator in this case, is one great big walking red flag. And there were lots of people in Maddie's life. Nobody acted to keep her safe. So who was she and what happened? On the 26th of February of this year, 2024, we're now on the 20th of September 2024, by the way. But on the 26th of February, Maddie Soto was reported missing. There were 3 separate 911 calls made by different members of the family. None of those were made by Mum. Mum was at her mother's place of work, her mother's office, when the police responded to the call, as was Stephen Stearns, Mum's boyfriend. So Mum is Jennifer Soto. Her boyfriend is Stephen Stearns. Maddie's dad is Tyler Wallace. Now he lives in Texas. These guys lived in Florida. And so he didn't see her that often, unfortunately. They reported her missing. And right from the word get-go, the police were very suspicious about Jen and Stephen. And there is body cam footage of the initial conversations between the deputies and Jen and Stephen, whilst all of Jen's family are sat around in her mother's office. And they immediately become suspicious. And by the 28th, they had established by voluntarily taking Stephen's phone and downloading it that he had CSAN on his phone that included predominantly his essay of Maddie. They then became aware of video footage that demonstrated, as far as they were concerned, that Maddie was deceased when she left that property on the 26th in Stephen Stearns' car. The story that had been, in my view, created, but certainly scripted and parroted by both Jen and Stephen over and over again, was that Stephen had dropped Maddie off somewhere between 8:20 and 8:40 in the morning at school. He was going to take her for a McDonald's breakfast. That's why they left early. She then decided she didn't want McDonald's breakfast. And so he dropped her off early. And as she was walking away from his car towards the school, he saw her rummaging through her backpack and, in his words, shambling towards the school. He then said he went to a vape shop. It wasn't open. He went back to the townhouse, then hung out with Jen for a bit, then went back to the vape shop, came back, hung out a bit again, then went to do some errands down Interstate 192. And that included going to some card game shops because he is an absolute man-child and he wanted to find somewhere that had the latest release of the Lorcana game cards. I've not got any issue with anybody who does plays games, by the way. But you'll understand as we go through this case why I hold a great resentment towards this person and their acting like a child at the age of 37. Jen then went to pick Maddie up from school and discovered that she hadn't made it, and that phrase is parroted time and time again. And so they made some rudimentary attempt at searching and then contacted the police. So that was the kind of the scripted story that was provided by them. But police found footage of Stefan Stern's car leaving the complex where Jen Soto and Maddie lived, returning and then leaving again, each time with Maddie in the car. On the 28th, I think, or early on the 29th, Stefan was arrested for SA, basically, of Maddie and the CSAM charges. Now, at that time, he wasn't charged with her murder. They later found her body on the 1st of March, and it took them until mid-April to bring the murder charges against him. And that will be because in Florida, people are entitled to a speedy trial. So they're entitled to have a trial within, I think it's 56 days, if they so wish. And so you have to be kind of very far along in your preparation of a case before you contemplate issuing charges, unless you want to be doing things in a massive rush if people do choose to seek a speedy trial. So the police did it the right way around. They worked it hard. They made sure they had everything they needed, and then they charged him. He wasn't going anywhere because he'd already been arrested on the SA charges. So, who was Maddie? At the time of this incident, she was 13 years old, and she turned 13 on the 22nd of February, so only very recently. And on the Sunday night, so that would be the 25th, she had a birthday party at her grandma's house, so Jen's mother. And family members were there. Jen was not, because she was working. She'd recently got a new job, so she was in the training period and stated she wouldn't be able to get the time off. But the party went ahead. Stefan did not attend the party, and that has been explained in many different ways, but I think the most likely to be the truth is that maternal grandmother is not keen on Mr. Stearns and never has been, so he wouldn't have been welcome at the party. But he turned up very soon after Maddie had been dropped off at home. So she was dropped off by her auntie, Jen's sister, at about 8:15, 8:30, and he was there by 9:15. Jen had lived for several years with Maddie in the townhouse where they were residing. It was owned by Jen's father, so maternal grandfather of Maddie. And what he did was he charged them a minimal amount of rent, but then the other rooms in the property, it was a 4-bedroomed house, were rented out. And that's how he covered the cost of the property. Originally, he had resided there with them. But at some point a few years ago, he moved out and roommates moved in. The townhouse is beautiful. It's in Kissimmee in Florida. It is a lovely complex. It's got a pool, an outdoor pool, a big lake in the middle of all the houses. It's gated entrances front and back. Really beautiful, stunning place for a child to be raised, unless the house is essentially a torture chamber. Maddie attended Hunters Creek Middle School. She had a few close friends, but didn't have lots and lots of friends. And when we come to deep dive into the evidence, you'll see that her performance in school was not brilliant. And she was diagnosed with ADHD, had previously been diagnosed as being on the autistic spectrum, but then later reassessed, and it was confirmed that while she had some autistic traits, she didn't meet the criteria for being ASD. And she took ADHD medicine. So she took Adderall during the day, and she took some sleeping medication at night, which hydroxyzine. And she was also asthmatic and had an inhaler. She was very quiet at school. Many of the teachers described that she was nervous around adults, didn't want to speak to adults alone, had to be escorted by her friends if she went to see the counsellor, or back to a locker for any reason. Her grades weren't brilliant, but interestingly, in December, when Stefan moved out of the property, her grades became better. She started engaging more with school. She had less of what one teacher called sleepy days, where she would literally come into the room, put her head on the desk and not lift it up or do any work. That teacher described her as not having any symptoms of depression or red flags for trauma happening in her life. I mean, literally, the statements from the teachers is just a stream of red flags. How nobody sat down with this young girl and tried to understand what the heck was going on in her home life, I will never know. But they didn't. A family history. Mum and dad separated before she was born. Her dad then married when she was only literally a few months old. So she's known as stepmom for her entire life. Gets on well with the stepmom and dad, but doesn't see them that frequently. Her mum has bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety, and there are indications within the evidence that she has been the victim of some form of SA in the past. And she comes from a family where her dad has clearly supported her. He bought the townhouse, he's allowed her to live there. Her mother helps with Maddie whenever she can. Her mother is remarried and even Jen's stepdad, so Maddie's step-grandfather, would assist with picking her up from school and things if needed. Jen has at least one sister that we know about who lives reasonably close, who is also quite heavily involved in Maddie's life. So she had family support around her. But what was Maddie's daily lived experience? And that, as child protection professionals, is what we look at when we're trying to assess risk and decide what needs to happen in a child's life. And what the evidence demonstrates is that Stefan came into their lives when Maddie was around 6. He has entered into a grooming process with her and has then started to essay her, and the evidence dates back to when she was 8 years old for that being recorded by virtue of video and picture. And so Maddie was 8 when he started to actually film and photograph what was happening. The reality is that a perpetrator in this case won't have immediately started filming and photographing. So it's likely to have started sooner than that age 8. And it continued right up until she was essentially eliminated by Stefan Stearns for whatever the reason was that entered into his mind. There were about 1,700 images and videos depicting very regular essay, and I'll describe it like this. There were photographs of posing in provocative poses, stances. And there were also pictures and videos of him penetrating every area that can be. And the grooming process is clearly demonstrated in a number of the videos, and in particular one where she is very young and they're watching cartoons and he basically asks her to perform an act in order to get her phone back, and she only has to do it for 30 seconds. And so she does, because she wants to play on her phone. And that gives you a little glimpse and insight into how these perpetrators work, but we'll talk more about that as we get into the case in detail. But we've got 1,700 images and videos that are about Maddie. They later find a hard drive or pen drive, I think it was, with 35,000 CSAM images, not of Maddie, of other children. 35,000. That is not a small number. 1,700 of one child who you are actually doing these things to is not a small number either. And one has to question, if you're collecting that many, what are you doing with those images? Particularly when we know that he was active on an account on Telegram. It raises significant concerns, and we don't know a huge amount about the detail of what the police may have found in relation to that. And then her life on that Sunday night, Monday morning was cut short. We know that, albeit they weren't going to release the post-mortem results, a report that says the cause and nature of death was released by the Kissimmee Police Department, and the cause and manner of death was asphyxiation by strangulation. Now, we also know that Maddie had blood on her own blood, on her hands, her chest and her neck. We also know that Stefan became injured at some point during the course of Sunday night and Monday, with scratches that look remarkably like fingernail marks. If you're being strangled, you would be doing this against their hands with your fingernails to try and release the grip. And the evidence raises some interesting questions about what the motive might have been. And that includes no specific outright evidence, but the police on a number of occasions and the state attorney's office asking questions of Jen Soto that focus on Maddie's menstrual cycle, and in particular the lack thereof in February. Now, we know that Stefan moved out in December, but we also know that he'd visited a minimum of 3 times, and potentially more. So him moving out doesn't rule out him getting her pregnant. But even if she wasn't, the fact that she'd missed a menstrual cycle would give them a potential fear that she might be pregnant. And so both of those things would mean that somebody who is a perpetrator of this kind might feel the need, as forensic psychologist Dr. Gary Baccato regularly says, to eliminate the witness or the problem. So if she was pregnant, or they feared she was pregnant, she's a problem. She needs eliminating. If she's threatened to tell, she's a witness and a problem and needs eliminating. So these are all things that might have posed a motive. The other thing that potentially could have presented a motive for Stefan is Maddie had started to talk about having crushes at a boy at school. And the disgust in Stefan's voice when he describes that is quite palpable. So it may have been as very simple as jealousy on Stefan's part, because when you look at all of the evidence and all of the interviews, it becomes quite clearly demonstrated that in his warped mind, Stefan appears to have believed that his main relationship was with Maddie, not with Jen. And it's almost as though he's in some kind of arrested development emotionally. We know that he suffered from a traumatic brain injury when he was 8. The documented beginning of the abuse is when Maddie was 8, and it may very well be that actually his emotional congruence is with 8-year-olds. And I'm not suggesting in any way that that is an excuse for what he's done. What he has done is absolutely reprehensible. I have mixed feelings about the death penalty, but if there was ever a case where it's appropriate, it would be somebody like him. And we have to say, you know, he allegedly did these things because he's not been convicted in a court of law. But the reality is they found the photographic evidence on his phone, on his Google Drive, after he has handed it over, but told them that he's accidentally factory reset his phone. I think that's going to be a tough call for any defence lawyer to get him out of a conviction. They may be able to broker some level of deal, dependent on what he wants to say and who he wants to say it about. Before we end today, I just want to talk very briefly about Jen and her derivative use immunity. So Jen at the moment has not been charged with any crime. But there has been a growing call for her to be forced to face the consequences of her actions as a mother, whether that be her negligence in enabling what had happened to Maddie, whether that be some form of complicity in what actually happened, or in the elimination of Maddie, or her disposal, or just after the fact in terms of scripting stories and sticking to Stefan's version of events and not questioning things. There's been this growing movement of people who want her hung, drawn and quartered, essentially. And there was a release of a video, an audio interview of Jen by some senior detectives and the state attorney at the state attorney's office, and she was given derivative use immunity. Now that means that anything they learn as a result of that interview, they won't prosecute her for. Any previous inconsistent statements, because she made lots of them, she won't be prosecuted for. But if they find evidence of a crime completely independently of that interview, she can be prosecuted for that. Now, why would they have given her this? The answer is very, very simple. They want her to be a prosecution witness, and they want her to do it voluntarily, and they want her to spill the beans about what happened. And the reason for that is this. Lots of people have said, Stefan Stearns is banged to rights. There's no way that he could ever not be convicted of her murder and essay. And to some extent, that's true. About the essay, I can accept that fully. But any good defence attorney would be able to create reasonable doubt in the minds of any jury about who committed the act of elimination. And the reason for that is this. In that house were Maddie, Stefan, Jen, 2 roommates, 4 adults, 1 child. Child comes out eliminated. All he has to demonstrate is that, It could have been one of those people who did the actual strangling. That's all he has to say. He only has to come up with a story that makes that plausible in some way. And actually, there are stories that would make that plausible because a few have been mooted. One which I think stands a reasonable level of prospect of success in raising that reasonable doubt is Jen comes home from work at 10:30. Stefan is in the middle of essaying Maddie. Jen, who was already described in one of her interviews that her biggest fear was the Woody Allen effect and Maddie growing up and running off with Stefan, becomes enraged with jealousy and doesn't attack Stefan but attacks her competition for Stefan, which is Maddie. And that is somewhat supported by a poem that Stefan wrote after the events, in which he says, "I would never have wanted that for you." And he says something similar in a telephone call with his father, I think, or in an email. We'll get to those bits of evidence. But that's a potential truth that might be plausible. Without one of them spilling the beans on the other, that's a really difficult situation. And the only reason that this is a valid death penalty case is because of the Elimination Act. If he ends up with essay and false reports to police and messing with a corpse. Oh Christ, I've completely forgotten the phrase. Then the death penalty is off the table. If the elimination itself remains in, the death penalty is on the table, and the state attorney has stated that they are seeking the death penalty. So they are going to want to be able to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the burden of proof that they have to meet. Can the jury be 99.9% certain, i.e. beyond a reasonable doubt, that he did the actual act of strangling her? And the only people who know whether that's true are the people that were in the house. So they're trying to get Jen to soften up and spill the beans. That's a process, so she'll probably have a few interviews with them. And it may be that she opens up more over time, because she didn't really open up in the first one that we've heard. Does that mean that she'll never be charged with anything? I don't think that's the case. I think, she's still not out of the woods, so to speak. But they're looking at it, small fry neglect charges as opposed to a murder charge and a death penalty case. And they'd rather have her as a cooperating witness than get her for some kind of peripheral involvement, as it were. Do I think she should be held to account? Absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt. Do I think she will be? I think that will depend on the success of their attempts at making her spill the beans. And on that note, guys, I'm going to leave you for tonight, and we'll get back into it in the next one, and we'll talk about what signs were missed that we can look at in all the various evidence, and what we can do to prevent this happening in the future. After that, we'll then go into a real deep dive of the evidence and the case against Stephen Stearns and the potential charges that Jen should face or could face. So it just remains for me to say thank you for being here. If you enjoyed this video, please do hit the like and subscribe buttons. Please leave me a comment. I love to see and read your comments, and let me know if there's any other cases that you want me to cover. Please, if you see something, say something. Until next time, look after yourselves and each other.